U.S. inflation is running at its highest rate in 4 decades, and Americans' incomes are not keeping pace. Next week, we'll see the release of America's second quarter GDP data. It could show economic contraction, just as it did in the first quarter. All of that put together, plus many other data points, may point to a recession. Let me bring in Larry Summers for his thoughts. He was Treasury Secretary in the Clinton administration and last year repeatedly, presciently warned that inflation could be coming. Larry, let me ask you first, just looking forward, what does the state of the economy look like? A recession plus inflation, which means stagflation? How do you see it?
I think there's a very high likelihood of recession. When we've been in this kind of situation before, recession has essentially always followed. When inflation has been high and unemployment has been low, soft landings represent a kind of triumph of hope over experience. I think we're very unlikely to see one. Whether or not we put inflation fully back in the bottle with that recession, I think is very hard to judge at this point. I've been encouraged by the Fed's commitment to do that, but other central banks at other times have professed to be committed, but have not done enough once the economy turned down to actually assure that inflation came down substantially. So I think there's also a greater risk of stagflation and this episode being with us for some number of years than the market is currently discounting.
So what does this mean for, the average person? Because what you're describing is an aggressive Federal Reserve raising rates, which means mortgages get more expensive, loans of every kind get more expensive. Almost certainly, economic activity slows, maybe a recession, harder to buy houses, harder. So there's pain coming.
I think there is pain coming. That's what happens when you borrow too much in order to overspend. But I think the important thing to remember is we've had a ton of pain because of inflation. We've had prices go up 3 or 4% a year faster than wages over the last 12 months. And that kind of thing is going to continue unless we do what's necessary to bring inflation down. And so I think we do need strong action from our central bank. We need the government to do the other things that it can do. It can take tariffs off, which will bring down prices of goods that are imported or compete with imports. We can bring down pharmaceutical prices by using government's purchasing power for aid. We can pursue what we clearly need, which is a both-and energy policy that promotes the availability of anything that will produce energy so that the price of energy comes down. There are things we can do. We can bring down the budget deficit so it doesn't all have to rely on the Fed by doing tax increases that are starting with just enforcing the tax law we have with respect to the people who don't pay taxes. There's a lot we can do to contain or control inflation. But if we continue with the kind of ostrich policies we had in 2021, there's going to be much, much more pain later. I think that's increasingly appreciated, and that improves our prospects. But I'm afraid I can't be confident that we're going to get through this without a recession.
I got to ask you about this. One of the people who disagreed with you in previous years has been Paul Krugman, who has written something where he says, you were right, he was wrong about inflation. But he says you were right for the wrong reasons, that actually the big COVID spending bill didn't have that bad an effect on the economy. What really happened was something unforeseen by anybody, which was that coming out of the pandemic, supply chains got screwed up. people started buying lots more goods rather than services, and all those kind of snafus and log jams caused by the pandemic are really what has produced this inflation.
There wouldn't have been nearly the same kinds of supply chain problems if huge amounts of money had not been put in people's pockets that enabled them to spend. If we weren't giving people who were laid off unemployment insurance that was far more than the salaries they had been earning, if we weren't mailing checks willy-nilly to families, there would have been less spending. That would have meant less bottlenecks. It was predictable that supply would be reduced, given that we had a pandemic. But when supply is reduced, you have to reduce demand as well if you don't want to have substantial inflation. Printing money and distributing it well ahead of the supply of goods is a prescription for inflation, and that's what we did. We injected enough money into the economy to make total spending grow at an 11.6% rate last year. When you have 11.6 growth rate in spending, then on any reasonable theory of how much capacity there is, you're going to have a lot of inflation. And that's what we did.
Larry Summers, pleasure to have you on.
Thanks.